Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King. Now, The Drawing of the Three was published in 1987, and this is a sequel to Stephen King's 1982 novel, The Gunslinger. Now, both The Gunslinger and this book are the first two books of Stephen King's epic fantasy series, The Dark Tower. Now, I have read all the Dark Tower books before, and I actually used to have reviews of all the Dark Tower books up on this YouTube channel in the past, but I'm currently in the process of rereading the entire series, and I'm also in the process of re-reviewing the entire series, so I took down all my old Dark Tower reviews, and now I'm re-reviewing the entire series, and hopefully I'm done with all this before the new Dark Tower movie comes out this summer. Now, The Drawing of the Three, in my opinion, is an excellent book, and to me this is even better than The Gunslinger. Like, don't get me wrong, The Gunslinger, it's a good book, and it is a necessary book to read if you want to read the rest of the series, but in my opinion, this is where the series really does pick up. Like, obviously, it's necessary to read The Gunslinger before you read this book, but in my opinion, like, even if you didn't like The Gunslinger, I still recommend giving this book a read, because once again, in my opinion, this is where the series really does start to pick up. And The Drawing of the Three is not just a great addition to the Dark Tower series, but to me it's just a good book in general, and it touches on a lot of really interesting themes like redemption and addiction and culture shock and culture clash. Now, in order to explain the plotline of this book, I do want to briefly go over the plotline of The Gunslinger, and in my plot description of The Gunslinger, I might give away what could be considered some minor spoilers. Now, Book 1, The Gunslinger, was set in this alternate universe known as Midworld, which is a world very different from our own. At the same time, though, it's heavily implied that Midworld used to be a lot like our world thousands of years prior to the events of the story. Now, the story followed a man named Roland Deschain, who was the last gunslinger. Now, in this world, gunslingers were basically like knights in a way, and a long time ago, like years prior to the events of the story, there was a war that wiped out all the gunslingers, with the exception of Roland. Now, in the first book, Roland is pursuing this evil wizard known as the Man in Black because he needs the Man in Black to take him to what's known as the Dark Tower. And at the end of the first book, Roland does finally catch up with the Man in Black, and the Man in Black tells him that his world is just one of many. Essentially, there are hundreds, thousands, millions even, perhaps even an infinite number of parallel universes, and it turns out that Midworld is just part of a long chain of parallel universes, and it turns out that all these universes are held together by this thing called the Dark Tower. Essentially, the Dark Tower is the linchpin of all existence. And the Man in Black tells Roland that in order to continue on his quest for the Dark Tower, he has to find 3 people to aid him on his quest, and these 3 people are the Prisoner, the Lady of Shadows, and somebody known as the Pusher, or Death, as the Man in Black calls him. So, this book picks up where the Gunslinger left off. In the beginning of the book, Roland wakes up on this beach, and eventually on this beach he finds 3 doors, and each of these doors lead into what from Roland's point of view is an alternate universe, but as it turns out is actually our world, but each of these doors lead into our world in different periods of time. So the first door that Roland comes to leads him into our world in the year 1987, which was present time for when this book was written, and it leads Roland to the prisoner. The second door that Roland comes to leads into our world in the year 1964, and this leads Roland to the Lady of Shadows, and the third door leads into our world in the year 1977, and this leads Roland to the Pusher. And basically, in order to continue on his quest for the Dark Tower, he has to go into our world in these different time periods and draw 3 different people from our world from 3 different time periods to aid him on his quest for the tower. Now, in the book, there are these giant lobster-like creatures coming out of the ocean, and these creatures Roland ends up calling the Lobstrosities, and in the beginning of the book, Roland is actually attacked by one of these lobster-like creatures, and it turns out the Lobstrosities are actually poisonous, so throughout the whole book, Roland is slowly being killed by whatever poison these lobsters infected him with. So throughout the whole book, not just is Roland trying to draw these 3 different people from our world into his world, but he's also trying to find medicine or some kind of antibiotic to possibly help him with this infection. Now, the book is kind of broken up into 3 sections. The first section of the book is about Roland going into our world in the 1980s. The second section of the book is about Roland going into our world in the 1960s, and then the third section of the book is about Roland going into our world in the 1970s. So in the first section of the book, Roland comes to the first door, and this first door actually leads him into the mind of a man named Eddie Dean, who is this heroin addict who lives in New York City, and the book focuses a lot about how he became addicted to heroin, and it also focuses on how, because of his heroin addiction, he has gotten involved with drug smuggling and stuff like that, and Roland, he pretty much invades this man's mind, and this man becomes aware that his mind is being invaded by some kind of an alien force. He doesn't realize at first that it's a man from another dimension invading his mind, but basically in this first section of the book, Eddie is involved, both Eddie and his brother Henry are involved with drug smuggling, and they get involved with the mafia, and Roland kind of helps him with this scenario, which I won't give too much away, but basically this first section of the book ends with Roland physically taking Eddie out of our world and into Midworld. The second section of the book is about Roland and Eddie coming to the second door. The second door leads Roland into the mind of a woman named Odetta Holmes. Now, Odetta Holmes is this African-American woman who lives in New York City in the 1960s, and she's a civil rights activist, and it turns out she's actually wheelchair-bound because something happened to her a few years prior to the events of the story that actually severed both her legs, and now she's in a wheelchair, and it turns out this woman, Odetta, actually has split personality disorder, and her alternate personality is this woman named Detta Walker, and it turns out that Odetta is completely unaware that she has split personality disorder. But basically, in this section of the book, Roland ends up taking Odetta/Detta into Midworld, and Odetta is this very nice, like, sweet woman, but Detta is a complete bitch. And throughout the whole book, Odetta is constantly going back and forth between her two different personalities. So at one moment she's Odetta, and then at another moment she's Detta, and this becomes a major problem for Roland and Eddie. And the third section of the book is about Roland coming to the third door, which leads into our world in the year 1977, and this leads Roland to a serial killer named Jack Mort. And without giving too much away, this man, Jack Mort, actually does have a connection to Odetta, and he has a connection to a character named Jake Chambers, who is a character from the first book, The Gunslinger. Jake Chambers was this young boy from our world who Roland met in the first book. Now, as I said, The Drawing of the Three is an excellent book, and not just is this a great addition to the series, but it's also just a good book in general. Now, one of the things I liked most about this book is this book really did touch on the theme of redemption, especially with the character of Eddie Dean, because Eddie was a heroin addict in our world, and he got involved with organized crime, and you really do get the idea that had Roland not intervened with his life probably would have ended very badly. Like, things probably would not have ended well for Eddie had Roland not intervened. And even though Roland does take Eddie out of our world and into a world that is completely alien to him, Eddie starts to realize that he's happier in Midworld joining Roland on this quest for the Dark Tower than he was in his own world. In a lot of ways, Roland did kind of save his soul by taking him out of our world and bringing him into Midworld. And in this book, you start to see Eddie overcome his heroin addiction. And even Roland starts to find some redemption in this book, because for years, the only thing that Roland ever cared about was his quest for the Dark Tower, and he has been obsessed with finding this tower, and now with meeting Eddie and Odetta, he has found something to care about other than his pursuit of the Dark Tower. And also, I don't want to give too much away about what happened at the end of the first book, but Roland did do something really bad at the end of the first book that would cause somebody to really kind of hate this guy, but he does kind of redeem himself for what he did at the end of the first book in this book, so even Roland starts to find some redemption in this book. And even Odetta starts to find that she's happier in Midworld than she was in her own world. Now, I'm not sure if I would call it redemption in her case, because obviously it's not her fault that she had split personality disorder, but the whole point is that she had kind of a miserable life in her own world, but now that she's been taken into this alien world, she's found that she's happier in this world than she was in her own world, the same as Eddie. Like, both Eddie and Odetta had really troubled lives in their own world, but now that they're being brought into Midworld, they found a new purpose and found kind of a new meaning for life. So, redemption is a major theme in this story. And another thing I thought was really interesting about this book is each section of the book almost could have been its own story if you removed all the fantasy elements. For example, the first section of this book, which is about Eddie and his brother Henry getting involved with drug smuggling, really works as kind of a crime drama story about addiction, and that could have been its own story about Eddie, like, dealing with his heroin addiction and dealing with the fact that he got involved with organized crime. Like, that could have been its own story, the same as the second section of the book. The second section of the book could have been its own story about a civil rights activist who has split personality disorder, and it could have been its own story dealing with the themes of racism and the themes of multiple personality disorder. And even with the third section of the book, the character of Jack Moore part, could have worked as the villain in a standalone Stephen King story. Like, Stephen King could have easily used that character as the villain of a serial killer story or something. So you really do get the idea that Rowling, essentially, when he came into our world, he kind of intruded on these stories in progress. And another thing I thought was really cool about this is the whole theme of culture shock and culture clash. For example, when Roland enters the minds of these people and he sees into our world, he's really taken aback by a lot of the things that are in our world. For example, there's a part of this book when Eddie is walking around New York City and Roland is inside Eddie's mind and he's seeing through Eddie's eyes and he's just taken aback by how tall the buildings are, and he's never seen buildings that tall. And also, there's a part of this book where Roland actually has some hot dogs and some soda, and, like, he's just taken aback by how sweet soda is, and also, like, there are certain, like, phrases that are used in our world that Rowling doesn't understand, and also when Eddie becomes, like, a part of Midworld, Eddie starts making, like, pop culture references that obviously Rowling is not going to understand, so I thought this book really handled the idea of culture clash and culture shock really well, and I thought it was handled pretty realistically in terms of how a person from another dimension would actually react to stuff from our world. And it also handled the whole idea of people from our world going into this other dimension. It handled it pretty realistically in terms of how a person would actually react to going into another dimension. And you even get a sense of culture clash with Eddie and Odetta, because even though Eddie and Odetta are from the same world, they're from two different time periods of this world, so it's really interesting seeing a man from the 1980s talk with a woman from the 1960s. And another thing I really liked about this book was the mixture between realism and magic, because you have scenes taking place in Midworld, which is very much this fantasy setting, but then you have scenes taking place in our world where the people from our world are dealing with real-world issues, and I thought that was really interesting how it jumps back and forth between this fantasy setting and this real-world setting, and the fact that you had scenes in this book taking place in the quote-unquote real world oddly made all the fantasy aspects of this book more plausible, in my opinion. But yeah, once again, The Drawing of the Three is a very good book, and it's a great addition to this series, and in my opinion, even though this was the second book in the series, this is where the series really does start to pick up. Now, of course, this was only the second book in the Dark Tower series, but as the series went on, it was revealed that pretty much all of Stephen King's other books connect to the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form, and in this book you do notice some connections with a few of his other books. For example, in the parts of this book that take place in our world in the 1980s, there's a certain point where a criminal named Janilli is briefly mentioned, and that could possibly be the character of Richie Janilli from Stephen King's novel Thinner. Also in this book, there's a part where Roland recalls having one time crossed paths with a very powerful wizard named Flag. Now, of course, readers of Stephen King's books would realize that he's referring to Randall Flagg, who is the main villain of Stephen King's novels The Stand and The Eyes of the Dragon, and Flagg would go on to become a major antagonist in this series. Technically, he already was, however, at this point in the series, that wasn't revealed, because later on in the series, it's revealed that the Man in Black and Randall Flagg are actually the same person. However, at this point in the series, it appears that they're two different people, which implies that Flagg probably has the ability to change his appearance, which would explain how Roland met both men in the past without realizing that they're both the same person. Roland also mentions these two men named Thomas and Dennis, who are both characters from The Eyes of the Dragon. I also noticed a possible connection with Stephen King's novella The Mist. Now, The Mist is actually supposed to be connected to this series, but I'm not sure if what I'm about to bring up is actually a connection or not. Now, The Mist was about this small town that gets invaded by this supernatural mist that is inhabited by these otherworldly creatures that could very well be from another dimension. And in The Mist, there's a part where the main character described seeing what looked like a giant lobster in the mist. And in this book, you have the lobstrosities, which are these giant lobster-like creatures, and it's possible that maybe the giant lobster that the main character of The Mist saw was actually a lobstrosity. Now, later on in this series, you find out that there are these spaces between the worlds known as the Todash Darkness, and in these spaces, monsters dwell, and connecting The Mist to the Dark Tower series, it seems most likely that the creatures in The Mist were actually from some dimensional gateway leading to the Todash Darkness. Now, assuming that the lobstrosities are not native to Midworld, perhaps they're actually creatures from the Todash Darkness. Now, of course, they're coming out with a Dark Tower movie this summer. Now, the characters of Eddie and Odetta are not going to be in this new Dark Tower movie. However, I'm assuming if they do sequels to this movie, I'm assuming that the characters of Eddie and Odetta will appear in the sequels to the Dark Tower movie. Now, there has actually been some talks of Aaron Paul, who played Jesse Pinkman on Breaking Bad, playing the character of Eddie Dean in the Dark Tower movies, and I could actually really see that, and apparently Aaron Paul has actually expressed interest in playing this character. So yeah, that's my review on The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King, which is the second book in his Dark Tower series, and bye.